Right now, an internal briefing note is circulating between a small group of central bank staff, sovereign debt lawyers, and defense analysts. Its working title is blunt: Reset Protocols, Historical Debt Liquidation Events and Current Trajectory. The first page opens with one sentence that sets the tone. When politics and arithmetic collide, arithmetic wins. Below that, there's a simple timeline: Roman debt crises, medieval royal bankruptcies, revolutionary cancellations, hyperinflations, post-war resets. Each episode looks unique in the moment. In the table, they follow one pattern. When the numbers break, the system chooses reset, not compromise. The note does not ask whether there will be another reset. It treats that as a given. The only questions it tracks are when, in what form, and who absorbs the loss. To answer them, the authors go back to the first documented episodes. Early Rome, where debt was not just a financial contract, but a direct chain between creditor and debtor. Medieval Europe, where kings owed money to merchants and bankers, then discovered they could erase those promises with a signature and a sword. Modern cases, where printing and inflation do the same work more quietly. The report's thesis is not optimistic or pessimistic. It is mechanical. Sooner or later, every overextended system either restructures openly or destroys its obligations indirectly. The Roman section starts with the debt bondage crises of the early Republic. In that structure, unpaid debts could turn into physical bondage. Citizens who fell behind on payments risked losing land and freedom. As military campaigns expanded and small farmers were pulled away from their fields, more of them ended up in that trap. Social tension built under the surface, then periodically broke into open conflict. Each time the political class faced the same equation: enforce every contract and risk civil war, or wipe out a share of claims and reset the system. Several times they chose the reset. The mechanisms were different. Sometimes it was a one-time cancellation of certain debts. Sometimes it was a legal reform that made future bondage less severe. In internal language, the report labels these events as Roman Reset 1, Roman Reset 2, and so on. The details vary, but the pattern does not. When the weight of private obligations threatened the state's ability to field an army and collect taxes, policy stepped in and sacrificed the claims. In that sense, the reset was not a moral gesture. It was an operating decision to keep the core system alive, even at the cost of breaking contracts. A similar logic appears in later Roman history, when the empire used debasement rather than formal cancellation. Instead of telling creditors you will not be paid, emperors changed the money itself. By cutting the silver content of coins, they delivered payment in name but not in full value. On the surface, debts were honored. In reality, purchasing power was wiped out. The note treats this as another form of reset, only processed through the mint instead of the courts. The state chose not to default on paper. It defaulted through the unit of account. From there, the briefing moves to medieval Europe, where the actors are kings and the creditors are merchant families and early bankers. Here, the tool of choice is explicit default. Rulers borrow to finance wars, palaces, and dynasties. When tax flows disappoint and campaigns go badly, they face a choice: raise taxes in already strained societies, cut prestige spending, or refuse to pay. Several monarchs chose the third option. They declared that certain debts were void, or they expelled creditor communities and seized their assets. In the report's framework, these are top-down resets. the sovereign erases obligations by decree, sometimes backed by violence. The pattern again is not moral, it is structural. As long as the tax base and the economy could carry the load, deals held. When that base shrank or plateaued while obligations grew, something had to give. The briefing notes that, in these eras, default was not treated as an unthinkable horror. It was treated as a dangerous but sometimes unavoidable tool in the king's kit. Reputation suffered, but the system continued, sometimes under a new ruler or a new financial arrangement. The debts died, the state survived. The next step on the line is revolutionary cancellations. Here, the reset becomes ideological. When social and political tension reach a breaking point, revolutions often bring with them a clean slate on old obligations. Bonds issued by monarchies are declared null and void by new regimes. Claims held by internal elites or foreign powers are simply wiped. From the perspective of the numbers, it is the same story. A large stock of promises that cannot be met against a damaged or exhausted economic base. From the perspective of politics, the justification is different. The new order frames the cancellation as justice, not arithmetic. The note stresses that, regardless of the narrative, the effect is similar. Creditors take a hit. Savings tied up in the wrong instruments vanish. A new system, new currency, or new legal framework emerges. The load of impossible obligations is taken off the real economy. The risk moves into the future because the new regime still needs to borrow at some point. But the old chain of claims is cut. In the report's summary, revolutionary resets are high noise, high clarity. No one pretends that debts still exist. They are openly destroyed. The hyperinflation examples are treated as a quieter cousin of revolution. Here, governments do not always announce a reset. They simply allow or fuel price rises that erase the real value of debts. In high inflation or hyperinflation, fixed claims denominated in local currency are paid back, technically in full, but the purchasing power returned is a fraction of what was lent. The report calls this the stealth reset. It notes that while hyperinflation is chaotic and destructive, it also serves a simple mechanical function. It shrinks the real burden of outstanding promises when no one is willing to sit in a room and agree on explicit cuts. Post-war resets are different in tone, but related in function. After large conflicts, balance sheets are broken. States owe more than their economies can realistically service, especially if they have lost territory, infrastructure, or access to trade. Instead of letting inflation do all the work or defaulting unilaterally, some post-war systems have chosen negotiated restructurings and formal fresh starts. Old debts are written down, stretched out, or replaced with new instruments under new rules. Sometimes private claims are converted into equity. Sometimes they are simply frozen for long periods. In each case, the goal is the same: reduce the headline burden to a level that growth and taxes can support. The key point that the authors repeat is that across these 6 broad categories, early Roman cancellations, imperial debasements, medieval royal bankruptcies, revolutionary write-offs, hyperinflations, and post-war restructurings, the underlying trigger is similar. A gap opens between what has been promised and what the real economy can deliver over any reasonable horizon. For a while, politics tries to bridge that gap with language, optimism, and accounting tricks. Eventually, the math reasserts itself. When it does, the system has to pick some form of reset. whether open or concealed. From there, the briefing turns to the present. It does not claim that today's situation is identical to any single past case. Financial markets are deeper, instruments are more complex, central banks are more sophisticated, but the basic ingredients are recognizable. High and rising debt loads, aging populations, persistent fiscal gaps, and heavy reliance on low interest rates and asset purchases to keep the structure in balance. The report notes that many advanced economies are now in zones that, in past centuries, were associated with eventual restructurings or devaluations. It also points out that global interconnection makes the next reset harder to localize. In earlier eras, a Roman cancellation was Rome's problem. A medieval default hurt the king's creditors. Today, sovereign bonds, bank balance sheets, pension funds, and cross-border holdings tie many systems together. That means a reset in one major economy is likely to radiate outward. It may show up as banking stress in another country, as pressure on a different currency, or as a sudden repricing of safe assets. The authors sketch several broad pathways without declaring which one will occur. One is a slow, managed form of reset through moderate inflation over many years, keeping nominal promises but eroding their real weight. Another is a negotiated restructuring in some countries, where official creditors and private investors accept explicit losses in exchange for medium-term stability. A third is a more abrupt shift triggered by a loss of confidence, where markets reprice debt quickly and force policymakers into emergency decisions. All of them involve some group of actors absorbing losses that are currently hidden by accounting and language. At the end, the note returns to its starting line. When politics and arithmetic collide, arithmetic wins. It adds one more sentence: the only open variables are timing, method, and distribution of cost. The document does not tell the reader to expect collapse tomorrow. It does not offer a timeline. Instead, it frames a simpler but harder question for anyone watching the current trajectory. If 6 times in recorded history, systems that overpromised and overborrowed have ended up choosing some kind of reset, how different do you truly believe this round is? And on what, exactly, does that belief rest? In one of its more technical sections, the briefing examines why political systems resist the word reset until the very last moment. The incentives are straightforward. No elected official wants to be the one who admits that past promises cannot all be met. No central banker wants to say publicly that the current trajectory is unsustainable. As a result, the system tends to extend and pretend. Debts are rolled over, maturities are pushed out, interest costs are suppressed. The report notes that this maturity extension phase can last for many years. It looks stable, but it is actually a controlled drift toward a point where incremental tools stop working. The note then dissects the role of accounting in delaying recognition. Rules allow certain assets to be carried at face value, even when their market price is lower. Banks can treat some sovereign bonds as risk-free, regardless of the issuing state's fiscal position. Long-term pension liabilities can be discounted at optimistic interest rates. Each of these choices is legal. Each of them reduces visible stress in the short run. Taken together, they create an illusion that the system can service more promises than the underlying cash flows can justify. In that sense, accounting becomes a buffer, and then very suddenly, a mirror. Another thread deals with the difference between private and public resets. When a corporation cannot service its debt, the process is clear. Creditors meet, assets are valued, claims are written down or converted. The legal code provides a roadmap. With sovereigns, the process is less defined. There is no higher court with full authority. This asymmetry is one reason why sovereign problems tend to drag on. The report notes that, historically, when public debts reach levels that would be considered insolvent in the private sphere, the system relies on hope and central bank support rather than on the usual restructuring tools. That delay does not erase the problem. It just changes who will carry it. The authors also explore who usually pays in past resets. In Roman cancellations, large creditors lost legal claims, but some had already protected themselves by converting wealth into land and influence. In medieval defaults, foreign merchant families and domestic elites took visible hits, but small taxpayers eventually bore higher taxes or indirect costs. In hyperinflations, ordinary savers saw their wages and deposits evaporate, while those with access to hard assets or foreign currency preserved more of their position. The pattern that emerges is simple. The later a reset is acknowledged, the more of the cost shifts toward actors with the weakest hedges. One section is devoted to signals that tend to appear in the years before a reset. These are not predictions, but recurring patterns. Real yields on government bonds stay low even as debt levels rise. Official forecasts consistently assume stronger growth and lower rates than materialize. Political debates focus on how to spend, not on how to fund. Asset prices in certain sectors decouple from underlying incomes. The note stresses that none of these signs alone guarantee a reset event. Together, they suggest that the system is relying heavily on favorable conditions continuing indefinitely. The report then pauses on the idea of gradual resets that do not look like crises, but function the same way. One example is financial repression, keeping interest rates below inflation for long periods. In that environment, savers slowly lose purchasing power, while governments reduce the real value of their debt. Another example is targeted taxation or regulation of specific asset classes, which can shift losses to particular groups without ever using the word default. These methods are less visible than an outright restructuring, but they serve the same core function of bringing promises closer to what can actually be delivered. A further section examines coordination problems. In a world where many states carry high debt burdens, no one wants to move first toward an honest reset. The first mover risks market punishment, capital flight, and political backlash. The last mover risks facing a smaller pool of patient creditors and less global goodwill. The note suggests that, historically, successful post-war resets worked because they were coordinated and linked to a broader political settlement. In peacetime, with no single defining event, coordination is much harder. That increases the chance that the next reset will be piecemeal and reactive rather than planned. The authors also discuss the psychological dimension. For many citizens in advanced economies, the idea that their government might restructure debt, devalue significantly, or allow high inflation feels alien. They associate such events with distant countries or earlier centuries. The report warns that this mental model can itself become a vulnerability. If voters and investors cannot even imagine a reset, they are less likely to prepare for one in any form. That leaves them more exposed if, and when, policy is forced into a choice between explicit and implicit loss. there is a brief exploration of denial assets, instruments and narratives that flourish late in the cycle. These include products that promise high returns with low risk, built on complex structures that most holders do not fully understand. They also include political messages that claim growth alone will solve any debt issue, without any need for distributional changes or write-downs. The report does not single out specific products or parties. It simply notes that as underlying imbalances grow, the market tends to generate instruments and stories that make those imbalances feel less urgent. In its final analytical passage, the note ties everything back to the central idea. Resets are not aberrations. They are part of the long-run functioning of over-leveraged systems. Rome used law and debasement. Medieval kings used edicts. Revolutionary regimes used ideology. Modern states have used inflation, restructuring, and financial repression. Each tool has different winners and losers. Each leaves a distinct mark on history. But in every case, once the gap between promises and capacity grew too wide, politics did not permanently overrule arithmetic. It only shaped how and on whom the numbers were finally imposed. The last line leaves that thought hanging. If the past 6 major resets were not accidents but endpoints of the same process, the practical question is not whether there will be a 7th, but whether you recognize its outline before or after it appears on the front page.